Before we start, just a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. Only 2% are subscribed. At 1,000 subscribers, I'll be posting a special video. The front door rattled and I slid the chain back. Jules stood there with a folded lace and a tight grin. Behind him, a kid's cry rose and stopped like a hiccup. "Please," he whispered, eyes on the hallway, not on me. "My name is Mara and I am 29. I let him in and locked the door again. He laid the lease flat and pushed a pen across. "Tonight," he said, fingers drumming once, twice, then still. Footsteps outside the window, small, hurried, counting pressure. I checked the clock and felt my mouth go dry. If I signed, I wasn't a girlfriend anymore, I was collateral. He watched like a gambler waiting on one last card. Short term, he offered, breath shallow, shoulders braced for impact. 30 days, I answered, though I knew calendars lie under stress. A knock punched the wood and someone shushed a baby. I pulled the chain again and faced what waited. Lena stood on the step with a sleeping toddler on hip. 4 kids clustered behind her with bags at their feet. No greetings, just the count that lived in her eyes. She shifted the toddler higher and met my stare without retreat. "Can we come inside?" she asked, not quite a question. Jules stepped back and made space with a practiced move. I held the door and felt the house shrink by inches. The kids filed past and avoided my shoulder like it burned. The toddler woke and whimpered and buried a face in fabric. Lena bounced once and the sound cut off like a switch. That control told me more than any story would. I marked it and set it aside for later. We moved to the table and spread the lice open. Jules slid a crumpled envelope toward me and cleared his throat. I counted under the table and came up light by plenty. He watched the ceiling like the numbers might fix themselves. Utilities separate, my voice held steady because it needed to. Lena nodded once and kept her eyes on the lines. She signed her name with clean strokes and no hesitation. That confidence was a promise and a warning. The oldest boy tugged her sleeve and jerked his chin toward hallway. 2 younger ones drifted after him with wary feet. They moved like people who knew exits by instinct. I felt the exit under my own heels and didn't step. "Keys," Jules said and touched my wrist in a soft plea. I took the ring off the hook and weighed the moment. Once the metal changed hands, there was no rewind. I set the key down and watched the table vibrate. Lena's gaze flicked to Jules, then back to me like a test. Not romantic, not friendly, just calculus with skin and bones. "I keep the place clean," she said, jaw firm, eyes steady. It sounded like history and I wanted proof, not promises. I walked them through rules in blunt lines and short breaths. Quiet after 9 and no guests beyond family. Laundry by schedule and trash out before pickup or penalties. Every syllable felt like building a fence during a storm. The youngest kid pointed at the oven and made a face. "Hungry?" he murmured, voice thin, hands pressed to belly. Jules grabbed a grocery bag from the door and moved fast. He knew exactly where I kept the pans and that stung. Lena clocked that detail and tucked it away like currency. I saw the ledger forming and felt my gut answer. This wasn't charity anymore, this was a contract with edges. I sharpened mine and let the room hear it. "Last thing," I said, palm on the lease, pulse hard. If rent fell late, doors locked on day 3. No exceptions, no soft cushions, no mystery waivers. Lena nodded and did not blink, another warning. I signed, the pen scratched and my chest went tight. Jules breathed out like he'd been underwater for miles. He reached for a hug and hit my forearm instead. I kept my arms to myself and let silence speak. Keys changed hands and the youngest clapped once, tiny and relieved. Relief spread through the group like heat after frost. I felt none of it, only the weight of future noise. In my head, a small door closed and waited. Lena gathered the kids with quick signals and light touches. They moved down the hall toward rooms that were mine yesterday. The toddler spotted a nightlight and giggled and pointed again. That sound worked on me, and I hated that it did. Jules lingered in the kitchen and faced the blank window. "We'll make it right," he murmured, fingers tapping the counter. I let the rhythm run and noted each uneven beat. Promises always arrive on time, payment rarely does. The oven beeped and the smell pushed into everything. Not sweetness, not comfort, just proof that they had landed. My shoulders lifted to my ears and stayed there. I knew the neighbors would notice before morning. I opened a cabinet and pulled down plates with steady hands. I did not eat because my stomach stayed clenched shut. Jules reached for a plate and thought better of it. He left it where it was and looked smaller. Lena returned and checked the sink and the floor pattern. She memorized the space like a map she might need. Her mouth softened for a heartbeat and hardened again. We were allies for an hour. After that we'd see. Outside, a car crawled past and paused and crawled again. I pictured questions landing in the building chat by midnight. A favor rarely fits Klein in public view. I braced for judgment and kept my doors unlocked anyway. Jules took the trash out and stayed gone too long. When he came back, his eyes were rimmed with worry. Not guilt, not shame, just logistics and hope tied together. That mix breaks people when the bill arrives. I walked him to the door and held the knob. Temporary, he breathed and tried for the old grin. The grin never reached me, and we both felt it. He slipped out and left a draft I could not name. In the hallway, Lena stacked shoes in a fast row. She made lanes and assigned cubbies without speaking a word. Order grew in the mess and the kids relaxed. I clocked the skill and wondered what it would cost me. I turned off the kitchen light and listened for new quiet. It came in pieces and stopped and started and settled. My house wasn't mine the same way anymore. I knew the first payment would tell me who we were. The doorbell hammered before sunrise and I jolted upright. I opened fast and found the downstairs neighbor tapping his watch. Hallways blocked, he snapped, eyes cutting toward my stairs. I looked past him and saw bags choking the landing. Fine. I climbed the steps 2 at a time and started hauling. Shoes thumped against the wall and a zipper bit my palm. Move it inside now, I said, breath short, patience shorter. Lena appeared instantly and cleared a path like a drill, efficient. The little one reached for a bag and wobbled sideways. The oldest caught him by the elbow and nodded at me. They carried the rest in a practiced relay without chatter. I thanked no one and checked the stairwell again, clear. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert I had forgotten. Rent due today stared back like a dare I had accepted. I grabbed the envelope from last night and counted crisp edges. Short again by more than coffee money, problem. Bank opens in 20, I said and held out my hand. Lena peeled off a money order and kept her face blank. That covers the gap, she murmured, eyes on my wrist. I tucked it inside my jacket and locked the door, guarded. In line at the counter, I rehearsed 3 options. Accept it and hope the numbers stick for once. Reject it and trigger a fight I could not control. Ask for proof and risk looking petty, tightrope. The teller scanned the slip and frowned without speaking. She pushed it back with a tiny shake and a form. Canceled yesterday, she said, voice flat, nothing personal. My throat tightened and I took the paper, trap. I drove home with the receipt burning like a warning. Lena met me at the threshold with a damp towel. Pipe leaking under the sink, she said, sleeve dripping. I set the canceled slip on the counter and crouched, choice. Water pooled and crept toward the cabinet edge in sheets. I shut off the valve and watched the drip slow. A cracked washer stared up like the moral of a joke. Patch now or call someone later, money either way. Plumber this afternoon, I said and wiped my hands. Rent first, I added and held up the slip. Her mouth hardened and her eyes flicked toward the hallway. Try Jules, she said, then turned to herd the kids, deflection. He answered on the 3rd ring with traffic behind him. Why is the order canceled? I asked, voice steady. Silence long enough to hear his blinker and my pulse. I'll swing by at lunch, he said, words careful, alarm. Noise spilled from the back room and cut me in half. 2 of the kids squared off over a phone and charger. Timer, I said and held up my palms like a referee. 10 minutes each and then swap or lose it, order. They obeyed faster than most adults I knew. I clocked respect when it showed up without ceremony. I also clocked the charger cable starting to fray at both ends. Sparks later if no one watched that thing, note taken. The gas range clicked 3 times and failed to ignite cleanly. I turned the knob off and smelled the faint hiss. Windows open now or we test the alarm at noon. I opened them and watched curtain edges snap. Decision. The neighbor from downstairs popped his head around the banister. Smelled something earlier, he warned and eyed my ceiling. It's handled, I said and held his gaze until he retreated. Favor 1 was already bleeding into apology 2 pattern. Lena rinsed the towel and squeezed water with tight hands. You can dock the lake from next month if needed. It sounded generous and also like a door she built. I didn't walk through until I saw real numbers, line. Jules arrived with a guilty smile and a toolbox. He fixed the washer in 12 minutes like a pro. About the order, I prompted and kept my shoulders square. He rubbed his jaw and finally met my eyes, cornered. Her cousin bought it, he muttered in SPR. Ida's hands wide. Then she panicked and called it back last night. Why did she panic? I asked and watched him flinch. Debt collector sniffing around, he answered, new fire. I could feel my sympathy leaning where it shouldn't. I straightened it with numbers and the calendar on the wall. Cash by 4, I said and held up 4 fingers. Or we adjust the arrangement tomorrow morning, hard. He nodded once and reached for the toolbox and exit. Groceries later, he added and tried to lighten the air. Groceries are not rent, I answered and opened the door. He stepped through and looked back only once, telling. At 2, Lena knocked and handed me 3 crumpled 20s. Tip from a cleaning job, she said and tucked hair back. I counted slowly and kept my face without a wrinkle. Short by plenty, I said and let the silence stretch pressure. The oldest hovered by the frame with a folded flyer. He placed it on the table and tapped the number twice. Mom can do 2 apartments tonight, he offered, voice small. I felt my spine stiffen and my jaw grind, line crossed. School night, I answered and slid the paper back. He looked at his shoes and then at his mother. She held his shoulder and kept her chin lifted. Another option then, she murmured and waited test. I opened the hall closet and took out a spare lock. This goes on the basement door until rent lands. Not a threat, just a rule we all could see. Her eyes flashed once and then cooled, accepted. At 4, the buzzer went again and I braced hard. Jules stood there with a bank envelope and a receipt. Verified, he said and set both on the table. I counted twice and nodded once, balance restored for now. We did a quick walkthrough and set a laundry schedule. Times marked clearly and initials next to each block. Lena picked the earliest slots without argument or sigh. I noticed the compromise and filed it for later leverage, useful. When evening settled, the house held a new rhythm. Silverware clinked, cartoons murmured, a lullaby threaded through walls. My plate stayed untouched while I worked through numbers. Utilities would crush me if this pace held, forecast. I texted Jules and Lena the revised split with meter photos. No emojis and no apologies and no extra lines. Jules replied with a thumbs up that felt lazy. Lena replied with a period and nothing else, message received. Before lights out, the toddler wandered into my doorway. A stuffed animal hung by one ear from a small fist. Bathroom, the kid whispered and blinked at the hall. I walked them over and waited outside, guard again. On my way back, I noticed a new detail. Their door had a chair braced under the knob already. Someone there never slept without an exit plan ready. I understood the chair and also hated the truth, foreshadowing. I lay in bed and counted the day backwards slowly. No disasters, only 1,000 tiny negotiations with sharp points. Tomorrow would ask for larger compromises and probably louder ones. I promised myself one thing and meant it, no more canceled slips. The hallway breaker snapped and the apartment went dark fast. Small feet scrambled and a whisper cut through the quiet. I grabbed a flashlight and reached for the basement key. The padlock hung twisted and useless on the latch, broken. Lena stood at the bottom step with a flat screwdriver. She didn't flinch and didn't apologize and didn't move. The dryer died mid-cycle, she said and pointed at the box. My jaw tightened while I flipped the switch, lines crossed. Power returned and a cartoon jingle bled through the wall. I pocketed the mangled lock and held out my hand. You replace it tonight, I said and waited for response. She nodded once, but her shoulders stayed squared, warning. The oldest kid hovered with a wet blanket over arms. He tried to smile and failed, and then tried again. We need the evening slots, he blurted and looked away. I set the schedule on the door and tapped the rules, enforced. The buzzer shrieked and I checked the camera and swore. 2 men stood outside with folded chairs and a crate. Lena didn't meet my eyes and stepped toward the intercom. No visitors, I said and blocked the button hard stop. They're cousins, she murmured while fingers trembled near her pocket. Cousins eat upstairs, I answered and kept my stance steady. The men stared at the lens and lifted the crate higher. I held the line and watched them retreat, round 1. 10 minutes later, a knock rattled the back entrance loud. Jules squeezed in through the service door with takeout boxes. He lifted both palms like a referee calming a brawl. I told them to go, he breathed and waited, middleman. I led him to the kitchen and opened the meter cabinet. The numbers spun faster than last month and wouldn't lie. Usage has limits, I said and tapped the photo button. He winced and put the boxes down untouched, tension rising. Lena arrived with a towel draped over one shoulder. So you why'd the food and then me and then Jules? You promised help, she said and kept her voice level. He rubbed his temple and stared at the floor, cornered again. Cash first, I said and placed a jar on the table. Every load of laundry, every extra shower, every oven hour. I filed receipts under the jar and wrote totals plain. Lena's mouth tightened, but she pulled a few bills, deal struck. A crash from the hallway sliced through the standoff clean. The 2 middle kids fought over the phone again hard. I took the charger and put it high on the fridge. Trade chores for screen time, I said and set the clock order. Jules started fixing the broken lock with methodical focus. He swapped the shank and tested the clasp twice. New code, I said and held out the keypad instructions. Lena watched the digits like a safe was being sealed, resentment. The downstairs neighbor knocked his ceiling with a broom handle. He yelled about noise and rent boards and inspections. I stared at the floorboards and counted to 8 slowly. We're under control, I called and prayed it sounded true, thin ice. Steam poured from the bathroom and fogged the hall mirror. I cracked the door and waved a towel toward the fan. 10 minutes per shower, I announced and pointed at the timer. Lena's eyebrow lifted, but she didn't argue, score 1. The toddler toddled out with bare feet and goosebumps. I wrapped a blanket and handed over a cup of water. Small fingers gripped my sleeve and wouldn't let go. I let them hang on longer than I should, weak spot. Jules nudged me toward the porch and closed the door. We can make this work, he whispered and reached for my hand. I pulled back and watched his eyes flick upstairs. The flick stayed longer than comfort allowed, old gravity. 1 boundary more, I warned and leaned into the frame. No overnights, no surprise visitors, no backdoor entries. He swallowed and nodded and stared at his shoes. Promises again and proof still missing, clock ticking. At 8, Lena placed an envelope on the counter slowly. Partial, she said and tapped the corner twice. I opened it and found coins mixed with crumpled bills. Payment was real, but the shortfall still snapped, pressure building. The oven beeped and smoke edged out with a sting. I killed the heat and flung the window wide open. A tray hit the sink with a clatter and a hiss. The alarm stayed silent, but my nerves, close call. We ate in shifts with doors cracked just enough. Jules tried a joke and it landed without a sound. Lena cleaned as she went and never looked at him. I cleaned my plate and counted the exits again, habit forming. Before lights out, I installed the new basement lock firmly. I memorized the code and spun the dial twice. Lena watched from the stairs with the toddler on hip. We'll keep to the schedule, she said, test pending. I shut my door and leaned against it until breath steadied. The house felt balanced on something thin and sharp. One wrong move and we'd draw blood instead of lines. I slept with shoes by the bed just in case, expecting footsteps. A fist hammered the door and a badge flashed through the peephole. City inspection, the man called, knuckles raised for another hit. I unlatched fast and blocked the threshold with my shoulder. Complaint from downstairs, he added, pen poised for notes. Lena appeared behind me with 2 kids pressed to her legs. She folded a towel over her arm and said nothing. The inspector lifted his clipboard and looked past my shoulder. Common areas must stay clear today, he warned, already stepping forward. I led him to the hallway and breathed through a count. No bags, no folding chairs, no extra mattresses in sight. He crouched at the smoke alarm and tested the button once. Silence answered, and he raised an eyebrow at me. I grabbed a fresh battery from the drawer and popped the cover. The test tone screamed, and the toddler started to cry. The man checked a box and kept moving without sympathy. Back exit next, he said, heels scuffing my paint. We reached the basement door and the new lock gleamed. He ran a finger over the keypad and squinted at numbers. Was this recently replaced? He asked with a casual tone. Last week, I answered and kept my hands still. Lena drifted down 1 step and kept her face neutral. The inspector scanned the laundry corner and the outlets on the wall. He frowned at a cord patched with electrical tape in 2 places. Replace that by tomorrow, he ordered, eyes on me. Upstairs, he measured the kitchen window and the space around the stove. He pointed at a stack of plates drying too close to heat. Fire load must stay minimal near open flame, he said. Lena moved the stack without looking at me twice. A knock hit the back door and Jules slipped in fast. He froze when he saw the clipboard and the uniform. Who are you? The inspector asked without glancing up. Maintenance, Jules answered, shoulders squared like he meant it. The man gestured at the oven and the clicking starter. Fix the ignition lag and sign the work order here. Jules pulled a small kit and adjusted the line carefully. The burner lit at once and the inspector finally nodded. The oldest kid hovered with a letter from school clenched hard. He held it toward Lena and didn't lift his eyes. She tucked it into her pocket and kept her jaw tight. I clocked that secret and stored it for later judgment. We reached the bedrooms and the inspector counted sleeping spots. 5 minors, he said, gaze moving like a metronome. No additional overnight guests allowed under this occupancy. He turned toward me and waited for my confirmation. Understood, I said, palms open, voice steady on purpose. He wrote the note and circled the line twice for emphasis. Reinspection in 7 days, he continued, clicking the pen shut. Any violation triggers a formal citation, he concluded, eyes flat. He left as fast as he arrived and the stairwell hushed. The downstairs neighbor cracked his door and filmed our landing. I stared into the lens until he dropped the phone. The clip would still spread by dinner if I blinked wrong. Jules exhaled and leaned on the frame with shaky hands. Could have gone worse, he tried, searching my face. We still have the week, he added, voice too hopeful. I counted utilities in my head and saw a cliff. Every rule stands, I said, pointing at the posted list. No visitors, no blocked exits, no patchwork cords anywhere. Lena crossed her arms and looked past me to Jules. Then we need a quiet place for homework tonight. I opened the hall closet and pulled out a folding table. We set it against the wall and cleared a walkway. The oldest spread worksheets and kept his head down. The toddler tugged my sleeve and pointed at the bathroom. Inside the bathroom, the ceiling vent rattled like it wanted off. I hit the switch and the noise died, then surged again. Moisture dripped from the casing and darkened the paint line. I added a fan replacement to the growing list in my phone. The back door knocked again and a stranger stood waiting. Looking for Lena, he said, eyes scanning the room fast. A business card flashed in his fingers like a trick. Dead inquiries, he added, half a smile, zero warmth. Lena stepped forward and barred the threshold with her body. You can leave a card, she answered, voice flat as stone. He tried to peer around her shoulder toward the children. I shut the door between them and set the chain again. Jules paced and rubbed his neck while thinking too loud. We need a number for today, he muttered toward the floor. Lena counted the bills in the jar and pushed them aside. Groceries after homework, she said, eyes on the worksheets. My phone buzzed with a message from the property chat. The neighbor had posted my address with a passive caption. Safety concerns, he wrote, and asked for signatures tonight. I typed a reply and kept it clinical and cold. The oldest finished a math sheet and slid it my way. Check, he said, and waited without blinking. I scanned the answers and found one line off. He fixed it in seconds and handed it back without pride. Jules tightened the vent cover and the rattle stopped. He looked at me for approval and I didn't nod. Receipt, I said, and handed him a form to sign. He signed and walked the pen back like it weighed plenty. Lena lifted the jar and counted again with slow care. We're still behind, she said, a whisper meant for me. Then we trim usage and push the recheck Klein, I answered. She held my gaze and nodded once without surrender. Dinner ran like a drill with stations and quiet corners. No screens until dishes, no arguing over portions, no backtalk. The kids followed the rhythm like it had always existed. I watched the order hold and felt something almost steady. The business card from the collector waited on the counter. I slid it into a drawer and locked the drawer tight. Jules glanced at the handle and then at Lena's hands. She turned away and wiped the table in hard circles. At 9, I walked the unit with a final pass. Plugs unplugged, vents clear, doorways open, stove off. Lena checked the window latches and the hallway for clutter. We moved like colleagues instead of combatants, and it surprised me. The downstairs neighbor hit the ceiling twice with a broom. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to management. Inspection completed, I wrote, and attached photos and times. Paper trails protect you when neighbors want blood. Before bed, the oldest handed me the school letter quietly. Permission slip for a trip next week, he said. A fee circled in red waited near the bottom. I folded it and felt the week shorten by another inch. I locked my door and stood still until my pulse leveled. 7 days to keep the place inside the rules. 7 days to prove this arrangement could stand without chaos. I set an alarm for dawn and listened for trouble. An alarm shredded the quiet and I bolted upright. I ran to their door and smoke curled under the frame. Out I called, knuckles rapping fast, breath already burning. Locks scraped and the hallway filled with hustling bodies, panic rising. I shoved the window up and dragged the box fan over. Lena yanked the oven open with a wet towel. A tray clattered into the sink and hissed like a warning. The smallest kid coughed hard and clung to my leg, still coughing. Shoes on, I ordered, pointing at the mat without looking. The oldest herded the others to the landing with quick signals. I hit the alarm test again to stop the shriek. It kept screaming until I pulled the battery, worse sound outside. Boots pounded the stairwell 2 flights at a time. The tenant below had already called emergency services. 2 firefighters pushed past and swept the kitchen fast. Ventilate now, one barked, visor glinting, hand on the dial. They checked the gas line and the ignition switch. Heat but no flame control, the taller one muttered. He tagged the range and turned the supply off. Use cold appliances until a tech clears it, he said, strict. The smallest kid trembled and then went limp. I caught the weight and waved for space around me. Air, Lena said, voice steady, palms open to the doorway. We moved to the porch where night air cut sharp. The squad car rolled up behind the truck too fast. The officer stepped out and asked who lived here. Lena lifted her chin and counted the children by touch. He wrote numbers and watched her hands, assessing risk. Jules jogged around the corner, still tucking in a shirt. He froze when he saw the tape on the stove. What happened, he asked, eyes darting between faces, nowhere landing. I kept my arms folded and pointed at the tag, consequences. Fire crew cleared us to re-enter for blankets and water. The officer followed and studied the rooms without comment. He paused at the chair braced under the bedroom knob. Safety habit, I said, meeting his stare, no apology. He left a card and a caution about repeat calls. Second incident triggers a report, he noted with measured tone. My stomach nodded and then flattened into something cold. We had no margin left for mistakes, none. I set a kettle on the electric plate and waited. Small hands reached for mugs and missed on the first try. Lena wrapped the toddler in a sheet and rocked. Slow, she kept her eyes on the doorway like a guard. Jules checked the ceiling vent and the breaker switch. He hovered near me as if proximity could fix anything. You should stay with me tonight, he whispered close. I stared at him until the space between us widened, choice made. Replacement range by tomorrow, I said, tablet already open. Delivery window 8 to 12, I added, tapping the order. Lena nodded once and turned to mop up ash. The oldest gathered scraps with a dustpan, silent and precise. A knock rattled the back entrance while we cleaned. Same man from the debt office waited with a folder. He craned his neck to look past my shoulder inside. Not now, I told him, foot blocking the frame, steel. He smirked and slipped a notice under my hand. Court date, he murmured, then backed down the steps. Lena's jaw tightened, but her eyes stayed dry. I slid the paper into a drawer and turned the key later. The tenant below climbed the stairs and held up his phone. Board meeting tomorrow, he announced, lips pressed thin. He filmed the taped stove and the damp towel. Safety concern for the whole building, he added, loaded. I took a slow breath and counted the costs again. Extra fans, new range, inspection fee, possible hearing. The ledger in my head clicked forward one brutal notch. Charity had become accounting with teeth crunching down. The toddler's cough eased and the house settled inch by inch. Jules stood at the sink and washed his hands too long. Let me take them for breakfast, he offered softly. Lena wiped the counter in tight circles and shook her head, no. I printed a notice and placed it on the table. Compliance plan for the recheck, clear steps, tighter curfew. Sign that you understand, I said, pen centered in reach. Lena read every line and then signed, pressure accepted. We boxed the damaged cookware and set it by the door. No trash piles, no blocked paths, no excuses. The oldest carried the box outside without being asked. He glanced at me once and looked away, pride held. Before dawn, I checked detectors in every room again. Fresh batteries seeded with clicks that felt like promises. I taped the officer's card next to the schedule on purpose. Warnings work better when they stare you down daily. I lay back in bed and watched the ceiling breathe. No rest landed because the next call felt certain. Favors had timelines and hours was shrinking to hours. I set 2 alarms and kept my shoes near the door, waiting. The delivery crew called at dawn and then missed the window. I stared at the taped stove and the inspection clock. Every minute without that range tightened the noose on us. I dialed the store again and asked for dispatch, escalation. A truck finally backed in and 2 workers hauled the crate. They scanned the doorway and shook their heads at the measurements. Won't fit with the railing, one muttered while testing angles. Remove it, I answered, hand on the drill, no delays. We got the railing off and slid the unit through. They connected the line and tested ignition with quick taps. A clean flame held steady and my shoulders dropped once. The recheck timer still marched forward, no victory yet. Lena appeared with a checklist I had taped to the wall. She ticked boxes for exits, alarms, and clutter-free hallways. Kids will be out after 3, she said without looking. I nodded and called the city office for confirmation, locked in. Jules arrived with a stack of takeout containers for everyone. He placed them down like a peace offering and waited. You owe the electric deposit, I said while photographing the meter. His mouth worked and finally closed, message received. The downstairs tenant stomped up and waved a printed petition. Board meets tonight, he announced with a smug little tilt. He snapped photos of the new stove and ripped railing. Documenting damage, he added, eyes hungry, threat noted. I dragged Jules into the hallway and shut the door. After today you keep distance from this unit, I said. No more midnight fixes and no surprise drop-ins. He swallowed and glanced toward the bedrooms, old habits pulling. Choose, I added and watched him flinch like I slapped him. Help them by paying or help me by leaving. Silence stretched as he weighed comfort against cost. He looked at his shoes and backed away, answer clear. The inspector returned at noon with the same clipboard. He checked the stove and logged the model and serial. He eyed the railing bolts in the corridor corners. Better, he said, then lifted a finger, one last condition. He walked to the back exit and tugged the bar. It stuck on a warped strip and refused to release. He wrote a note and underlined it twice with pressure. Fix within 24 hours, he stated, final chance. I grabbed a pry bar in a level and worked. Lena held the door while I shaved the swollen edge. The latch clicked clean and the bar swung free. The inspector tested it. Wyson checked the box, barely made. We exhaled together and the house eased to neutral. He handed me a copy and warned about future calls. Another complaint triggers monitoring, he said with zero humor. I nodded and kept my face flat, understood. Jules lingered by the stairwell with hands in pockets. Room on my couch if things go south, he offered. Lena stared at him like he was a storm siren. Not an option, she said, chin up, line drawn. I printed a revised agreement and taped it to the fridge. No guests at any hour, no back entrances or side deals. Payment dates in bold with late phase listed clearly. Initial here, I said, and placed 2 pens, decision time. Lena signed without flinching and slid the paper back. Her signature looked steady, her shoulders looked heavier. Work tonight, she added, eyes flicking to the kids' room. I checked the time and did the math, childcare gap. Jules can stay in the hallway and monitor, I offered. Door open and everything on camera, I added. She considered it for 3 long beats and nodded once. Jules rubbed his neck and agreed, conditions nailed down. Evening fell and the board met in the basement lounge. I walked in with photos, receipts, and the clearance form. The tenant below waved his petition and counted signatures loudly. I placed the re-inspection pass on the table, counterpunch. Questions flew about noise, smoke, and hallway jams. I answered with timestamps and the delivery invoice. A manager asked about guests and emergency calls. Resolved and restricted, I said, eyes steady, no wiggle. The vote split and then stalled and then split again. Management sided with compliance and warned both sides. Fines for future violations, dismissal of the current complaint. The downstairs tenant cursed and stormed out, round ended. When I came back upstairs, the oldest waited in the hall. He held out the permission slip with a fresh signature. Teacher said the fee is covered by sponsorship, he whispered. His smile cracked through my defenses, tiny win. Lena returned after dark with aching hands and quiet steps. She counted out the rest of rent in tight stacks. No shortfalls, no IOUs, no canceled anything. I logged it and closed the ledger, breathing again. Jules hovered near the doorway and searched my face. I'm stepping back after tonight, he said at last. He pocketed his keys and looked toward the street. I'll send money on Fridays, he added, finally useful. I walked him outside and stopped on the top stair. You and I don't work inside the situation, I said. He opened his mouth and then shut it with effort. Take care, he muttered and headed down, distance set. Back inside, I checked the back exit one more time. The bar moved smooth and the frame held straight. No chair under the bedroom knob tonight. Lena removed it and leaned it against the wall, trust forming. I drafted a reference on a single page and signed it. Reliable under strain, keeps order, pays when possible. I placed it in an envelope and left it by her door. A safety net without strings, my last concession. Before lights out, I stood in my doorway and listened. No sirens, no stomping, no alarms clawing at my nerves. Just quiet shaped by rules and a narrow truce. It wouldn't last forever, but it was ours for now. I shut my door and clicked the lock with intention. Not a fortress, not a revolving door, a boundary. I was done being the cushion between everyone's emergencies. If the next line got crossed, I knew exactly what followed.